Hey friends, how's it going? When I first started out as an engineer, I had no idea what the career ladder actually looked like, or how much understanding it could actually change the course of my entire career. So today, I'm walking you through the full engineering career path, going over what each role actually means and what are the expectations at every level. I'm also going to reveal the realistic amount of money you can make. Having a clear understanding of all of these various roles and paths can really help you make a clear decision and avoid that career stagnation. So let's get right into it. Let's first start off at the beginning. Junior engineers. At this level, your main responsibility is to write code. Very simple. You'll be given clearly scoped tasks and your job is to deliver clean, working solutions. What sets a strong junior engineer apart is their ability to really get unblocked on their own. Whether that means taking the initiative to test your ideas with small experiments, digging through past tickets or documentations to find the right answers, or finally reaching out to the right people when they're stuck. So if you're a junior engineer, focus on these points and land as much code as you can. Now, there's actually one really interesting thing about junior engineering positions at FAANG, and it's that big tech companies rarely hire junior engineers through general applications. Most of the time, they recruit through university pipelines or some form of early career programs. So if you're thinking about going to a bootcamp or switching careers or coming from some other non-traditional path, just know that it may be much harder to land a junior role at a place like Meta or Google. So you'll likely need to build up some experience at smaller companies first and then make the jump. Now, the compensation for junior engineers at FAANG companies is around $180,000 to $200K. Honestly, in my opinion, it's pretty crazy, right? Most junior engineers at FAANG companies are fresh out of college. That means they're around 21. And they're making this kind of money. Now, next up is mid-level engineers. Most people reach this level after about 2 to 3 years of experience. At this stage, you're not just executing on tasks, but you're expected to own projects from start to finish. You should be able to take a standalone problem and break it down and plan your approach, and ultimately ship the solution with minimal handholding. You'll likely be running your own meetings by now and coordinating with other teammates and navigating through ambiguity on your own. At this point, it's less about doing what you're told and more about figuring out what needs to be done. So this is the expectation for mid-level software engineers at FAANG companies. Now, something that surprises a lot of people for this mid-level position is how often engineers who are called senior engineers at other companies end up joining Meta or Google as mid-level engineers. This actually happened to me. I was a senior engineer at Capital One, but when I joined Meta, I got down level to mid-level. And honestly, it was the best career decision that I ever made. Getting down leveled when you're joining a new company may feel like a step back, but if you take your ego aside and just think through it logically, it can make perfect sense. For example, at this point, salary bands are pretty much public knowledge. So companies like Meta, Google, and Amazon basically know that many senior engineers at other companies aren't even making what their mid-level engineers make. Maybe not even their junior engineers. Now, the compensation for mid-level engineer is around $300K in total. And it's still crazy, right? You're probably still in your mid-20s when you hit this. So it's pretty nuts. All right, now let's move on to senior engineers. This is the first level where you're truly expected to operate independently. You're not just writing code at this point, you're ultimately leading projects. That means taking ownership of like a brand new initiative, figuring out the technical plan, coordinating across teams when it's needed, and ultimately driving it to completion. At this stage, you're working very closely with your product managers and designers and other XFN leads to essentially have trade-off discussions and come to an alignment and define what you should actually build. At this point, you're also starting to mentor others. You're not going to be a formal like manager of any sort, but you're going to be expected to mentor mid-levels and junior engineers to ultimately get better. In my opinion, senior engineers are the bedrock of most tech companies. They're usually the largest like in terms of population wise. There's the most senior engineers from like an organization usually. Now, one of the most interesting thing about hitting the senior level is that at most companies, this is considered a terminal level. And what a terminal level means is that there's essentially no more pressure for you to keep climbing up. At previous levels like mid-level or junior levels, you actually usually have a timeline called like yellow zone or red zone to grow and get promoted, or you'll essentially get managed out. However, at senior levels, that pressure just totally goes away. Now, the compensation for senior engineers at Meta and Google and like Amazon is usually around 400 to 500K in total comp. In my opinion, it's kind of life-changing money, right? And it's a really strong level to be at. Now let's move on to staff engineer. And I would say staff engineer, that level is probably one of the biggest like major shifts and milestones that happen in your career path. And in my opinion, it's actually like a different job altogether. Ultimately, at this point, your job is to create leverage and additional scope. And it's not just through like your own work, but you need to do this through others and also unblock others and level people up all around you. Staff engineers are expected to lead technical direction for very complex and often ambiguous problem spaces. And this might mean designing systems that spans like multiple teams, solving long-standing scaling bottlenecks or driving major infrastructure migrations. The scale of the problem usually gets a lot bigger and tougher than what most senior engineers need to execute on. Because you're working with many different teams and organizations, you'll definitely end up doing a lot of alignment and building consensus and pushing forward like initiatives that essentially wouldn't happen if you were not there. So communication becomes a huge part of the job. This means you have to get really good at storytelling, framing trade-offs, and explaining why things matter at the end of the day. Now, mentorship also becomes a very core responsibility of your job. You're expected to level up engineers all around you. Now, I mentioned staff is like the first like kind of interesting milestones because at this point you could go into a lot of different archetypes. An archetype essentially is like a specialty of some sort. So you can have like a tech lead archetype. And tech leads usually owns like a roadmap for a team and they give technical direction for the entire team. So they work really closely and partner with the EMs and the PMs to make sure the team is building the right thing and succeeding. You could also have like a fixer archetype, which are essentially like hitmen that are dropped into high risk and chaotic projects, and they essentially restore the order and fix an insane amount of bugs. There's also project hybrid archetypes. Like these engineers are basically like PMs in a way. They write a lot of PRDs and they help like decide what to be built. They're more like a technical PM. Now there's also a coding machine. This type of engineer ships essentially a massive amount of high quality code. And there's also a specialist, which are, they're depending on like what area that you need to work on, like performance. You could be a mobile specialist, a security specialist, or like a media expert. Basically, sometimes they're just like these very specific areas that the company needs a lot of like support on, and that's when you need a specialist archetype. Now, there's more than these archetypes, but these are just a few to name. And most staff engineers actually don't fit perfectly into one archetype or another. Usually you lean into one or like two, depending on like your team that you need to work on and what you're actually good at. But at the end of the day, you need to find an archetype that works for you. Personally, I played both the tech lead role and also the fixer archetype, and I would say I'm pretty good as like a product hybrid as well. Now, compensation for staff engineers at companies like Meta, Google, and Amazon is typically around 600K to 700K in total. At this point, the numbers it's really life-changing, right? But yeah, the higher level, the higher expectations are. Taking a quick step back, at staff level, these archetypes is not the only things to consider. And in fact, for a lot of engineers, this is also the point where they start thinking about switching tracks to management. It's actually pretty common to see someone reach like, staff level, stay for a bit, and then move into engineering management. So let's talk about engineering management and what they actually do at a FAANG company. The role of a manager is to create an environment where your team can succeed. That ultimately means that you need to hire great people, make sure that they're working on the right problems, and ultimately help them grow into, really excellent engineers. You're still involved in technical conversations, but at Fang, your job, in my opinion, is no longer to make any real technical decisions. You could definitely contribute, but that's kind of up to the tech lead and the team. So you end up spending a lot of time thinking about your team's health and make sure that the team has enough support. Is the team operating efficiently? Are people getting feedback that they need? And are they being are they learning? Are they being challenged? Are they burnt out? There's just a lot of people problems that you end up thinking about. And when priorities shift or projects go sideways, you're gonna be the one who has to manage those expectations and steer that ship and course correct your entire team. You do end up working closely with product managers and designers and other EMs. So you're going to be translating between product needs and engineering realities and balancing a lot of short-term executions with long-term investments and setting up your team for consistent success. So in my opinion, engineering management is a very difficult job. Now, one interesting fact and something that a lot of people don't realize about engineering management is that it's often a lot easier to perform exceptionally as a staff engineer than a manager. And I say this because once you become a manager, your success is no longer entirely up to you and your work. You can be doing all of the right things, but if your team is underperforming or if someone leaves unexpectedly, that directly impacts how you're evaluated. So it could just really derail your performance. This, in my opinion, this is the first rule on the this whole ladder that we're talking about, where your performance is tied to others and not just your own output. The compensation for engineering managers at this level is basically the same as staff level engineers, the 600 to 700K range. But yeah, expectations are extremely high. Okay, so let's move on. You see, at Meta and Google, they both have a senior staff and senior management roles. They're basically like an intermediate role before principal engineer and a director role. At a high level for senior staff, you're basically doing all of the staff level roles, but just at a larger scale and more cross-organizational impact. And for senior managers, it's mostly your organization size that grows. So instead of managing one team, you'll be managing multiple teams or even a manager that manages other teams. I will say that senior staff and senior engineers make a lot more. They're in the millions, right? 1.2 millions or so. But yeah, let's move on to principal engineers and director roles, because I think at this point, it's a little bit more different. So at this level, you're expected to operate far beyond your immediate team or even your immediate org actually. Principal engineers take on basically everything senior staff and staff engineer does, and they scale it across multiple orgs and the entire business unit essentially. And they're going to be the main technical leader for the most important critical projects for your org. You're no longer just solving hard problems, but you're solving mission critical problems. You basically need to own a huge system that evolves over time. And one of the big deltas between senior staff and principal is actually a track record. You need to have landed multiple senior staff level impact to basically get to principal level. Like I said, I don't think there's that much of a delta between a senior staff and a principal, but in my opinion, the biggest change in this level is kind of the audience that you talk to on more of a day-to-day. You're not really just talking to other senior engineers or staff engineers and maybe directors, but I would say you're working more closely with VPs and high-level executives at this point. Now, in the flip side for management, directors, I would say it's still mostly about the organization size. Most directors at Meta have 100 to 200 something recursive reports. And you could just imagine the amount of people problems that come up when you're managing that many people. Honestly, the directors that I work with, they're always extremely busy. They're basically in meetings all the time, right? They're dealing with either people problems or technical issues or like some sevs, like every sev, every problem in the org is like your problem at the end of the day when you're a director. The pay at this level is like pretty ridiculous. I think you're in the range of 1.5 to 2 million. And it's like, I don't know. It's kind of hard to get clear numbers at this point because even like levels FII, where a lot of these data sources come from, a lot of directors and like principal engineers, because there's so few of them, so like they're probably not likely to like upload their data into like these kind of tools. So yeah, it's kind of hard to really know if these are accurate numbers, right? But yeah, it's basically ridiculous, I would say. Now I'm essentially going to stop the career ladder discussion at this point, but there is actually like, you know, more roles. There's like distinguished engineers or like fellows, and there's also VPs. You know, there's some companies have like senior director, VP level 2 and things like that. But honestly, those levels are like beyond this particular scope of the video. And to even get those kind of roles, you essentially need to be famous. You need to have like industry-wide impact or relevance. But yeah, so that's essentially it. There is actually one more bonus role that I do think is worth mentioning, which is a tech lead manager or a TLM. This role is actually like a hybrid role that sits right in between IC and management. TLMs are really rare. I've only seen maybe like 1 or 2 in my entire like career, like 10 years or so. But I think when it's done well, it's incredibly powerful. Everyone I've talked to who's a TLM tells me that it's like a very hard job. But essentially a TLM, they have less reports and mostly very senior reports. And so they're like coding 50% and then managing 50%. It's a really interesting role, and you usually find them in like infra heavy roles or infra heavy teams where it's kind of hard to have like a traditional team, because infrastructure code usually requires more senior engineers. So you have less of like this like juniors and mid-level engineers working on infrastructure. But yeah, that's basically it. I hope you enjoyed this video. Go and climb that ladder quickly. You know, I actually recently made a video on how to get promoted fast. So go and check that out if you're interested. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and like and leave me a comment, and I'll see you on the next one. Bye.